Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending where you are. Welcome to the newest webinar in the Scientist.com HBS legislation series. My name is Maria Menico, and I'm the Senior Category Director of Human Biological Samples here at Scientist.com, and I'll be your host today. I'm fortunate to be joined by Pauline Mespoulet and Caroline Rancati from France Tissue Bank, who will guide us through France's governance of human biological samples for research, focusing specifically on acquisition, storage, import, export, and any other uniquely French requirements. I'm looking forward to getting started today, but before we do, I want to cover a few brief housekeeping notes to help you get the most out of this experience. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to view on demand shortly after the live event. Next, if you take a look at the interactivity panel on the right-hand side of your screen, there are 4 tabs corresponding to chat, Q&A, polls, and handouts, so feel free to use them. If you experience any technical issues, please first try refreshing your browser, as this tends to fix most of the problems. But if you're still having trouble, please reach out using the private chat function and we'll help you to troubleshoot. We'd also love to hear from you, so please send any questions, thoughts, and comments using the Q&A tab, and we'll address as many of your questions as we can in the Q&A session, which will follow this presentation. And finally, you can also explore relevant resources in the Handouts tab to learn more about some of the content presented today. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first presenter, Pauline. Thanks so much for joining us today, Pauline. The floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Hi, Maria. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to present you another point of view of French legislation, which may be unfamiliar to those working with French human specimens. So I'm Pauline. I'm graduated with a master's degree in management of biobank and associated data. I start my experience in French Anti-Cancer Center in a tumor biobank, and then I moved in French Guiana, where I was operational manager of the Emegena Biobank. And since 2021, I am biobank manager at France Tissue Bank in the south of France. So the French legislation is a huge part of my job. So it's important for me to explain it to you. So Caroline, it's your turn.
Yes, so hello everyone. Nice to meet you. It's also a pleasure for me to get the opportunity to present you and get to learn you a bit of our French legislation surrounding human biospecimen. So I'm Caroline. I've been working in France Tissue Bank since 4 years as biobank manager, and I'm also in coordination of all of our suppliers. And let's go ahead on this huge topic and get in the deep of it.
So let's start with a small presentation of France Tissue Bank. So FTB exists since January 2020, and the objective is to support research team worldwide. We know that the difficult access to biospecimen and data is a reality for the end user. So we want to make easier the link between scientists and biological material. We work with partners specialized in oncology and inflammatory diseases, such as anatomocytopathology laboratories. So thanks to them, we propose a session of biospecimen, session of data, and a lot of prestation of personalized lab services. So if we focus on our suppliers, they are medical laboratories with the main activities are the screening and diagnosis of cancer. Our network, it reaches 33 platforms in France that represent more 1 million samples per year, and we have a retrospective access of 15 years. Also, FTB collaborates with a molecular pathology platform that permit the detection of genetics mutation of tumors. And our partners want to implement intern biobanks to make research possible, and they ask to have to be a little more precise. This is an example of the dataset linked to biospecimen. So in this case, EFFP blocks H&E slides and digital images are available to session. And with this, some data are associated. So like the patient data, so the patient gender, the age of the patient at the diagnosis, the histological pathology, the TNM, the percentage of healthy tumoral or necrosis tissue, and some immunohistochemistry data like PDL1 for the lung are available, and the list of analysis genes and the mutation status are available too. So that was an overview of the FTB activities. And before to continue with the legislation part, can you let us know if you are familiar with the French regulations surrounding the use of the human biospecimen in the research? So maybe yes or no. So I know this is a complex slide, but and I don't want to detail all the administrative procedures, but it seems useful to understand the classification of the research in France. So there are three main categories of research. The first one is interventional research focused on medicinal products like drugs. The second one is interventional research involving the human person. And there are categories for the use of data only called the research not involving human person. For each categories, there are different competent authorities who take decisions about the research itself, the use of the personal data, and the information given to patient. So depending the finality and the study design, a French researcher should know the categories of his project. But these procedures are mandatory for the promoter of the study. So Caroline will continue with the legal requirements for the specimen suppliers.
Yes, thank you very much. So first step in the human biospecimen treatment is the acquisition of it. And what is governing all of that is a donor consent. So in the French use, to use a sample, you are obliged to comply with the purposes mentioned in the patient information letter. So there are two types of donor consent. So the written consent, so which is one which is free and informed, which need to be given by a practitioner, and it's never definitive. That means that even 1 year later, if a patient decides to oppose to the use of its sample, it's still free for him to realize that steps. The second type of donor consent is the opt-out format with which we are working at France Tissue Bank, which is governed by a workflow in which we need to get the proof that the information was well received by the patient. We need to let the patient a delay to oppose to the secondary use of its sample. As always, it's never definitive, So even if you want to come back 1 year or even 10 years later with an opposition, we'll take it into account and destroy all remaining samples and all data that will be used for research. The only limits for this type of consent is that no constitutional genetic could be realized on the samples under an opt-out system. So to get a little bit more into the details of the donor consent, so whether in the written consent, whether in the opt-out format, there are some informations and some rules that needs to be followed for that type of document. So the first one is the patient rights. So all patient rights should be exposed and the terms to oppose should be clearly defined. As you will see, we'll also give you the details of all patient rights in front a little bit later in the presentation. Also, the information letter need to be understandable. So this means that it should be clear and understandable for patient so that all patient can take a decision with something they clearly know what will be done with their samples. It's also need to be honest, meaning that all given information should be correct and up to date. If any information are changed, the information letter will also be changed accordingly. Moreover, it should be didactic. So the purpose of the information is to give useful information in a methodical way. That means that it's also getting with the understandable point of view. That means that all patients should understand the purpose and all information given. It also needs to be complete. That means that all required information necessary for the patient decision making must be mentioned. Also, the information letter needs to be explicit, so it needs the information given will be done in a successfully revealed and expressed without vagueness, implication, or ambiguity for the patient to understand it as much as possible. It needs to give all purposes of the secondary use that could be done with the samples. And of course, we also need to give the patient an idea about the storage terms, meaning the storage location, the period and condition of that storage. Afterwards, when all samples have been acquired, the next step is to get into the preparation and the storage of it. So this is also something that is well covered in France. How are we realizing that process? So that process is under an IRB approval. That means that we need to get an approval from the French Ministry of Health and Research. This will work for 5 years. Each 5 years, that means that all authorization needs to be renewed as a whole. And as a whole mean there are 3 main parts in this authorization. So the first one is purely administrative part, so with all address, contact person, stuff like that. So not the main thing to talk about today. The second part is the technical part. That means that we need to give all informations concerning our activity, the localization of it, how security is ensured in this activity, how do we treat the wastes, how do we identify each sample and each data that can be concerned. We also need to ensure that all members on board are well qualified to realize those processes and also to get assurances towards this process. And the last part, which is one of the biggest parts in this authorization, is the scientific part in which we need to describe the sample type, the way samples are obtained, the way we inform our patients, and how do we collect the consents of each of our patients. Once all preparation, storage are fine, the next step for a human biospecimen to be transferred is, of course, the export of human biological sample. It's a little bit the same processes as for the authorization of preparation and storage. So it's under an IRB approval, so which is given also by the French Ministry of Health and Research. It's also worth for 5 years, and afterwards everything need to be renewed. And in terms of organization of that authorization, it's a little bit different. So we still got the administrative part, which is also a little bit linked to juridic purposes. Afterwards, the second part is to define the scope of use of the samples and where are the limits of that secondary use. So what we call the research programs part. And the last one is still the scientific part. So as before, we need to mention all the sample types that can be used, the way samples are obtained, the way we inform patients and we gather all consents. But we also need to include all information concerning the packaging, and the list of all consignees that could be concerned. And as I was mentioning, after all of that, we also get one other regulation to follow, which is the GDPR, so which is not only for French regulation, but which is a European regulation, which defined in the French regulation by the law on informatics and liberty. And in France, the authorities that control the follow of that regulation is what we call the CNIL, which is the French National Data Protection Authority. As I was mentioning to you a little bit earlier, so this is all the rights of our patients that we need to follow. So the first one is for a patient, the right to be informed, which was defined by the information letter that is given. And just a quick sum up. So this information should be concise, transparent, easily accessible, and it should be written in clear and plain languages. So that's a little bit all treated, the things that were treated before. Next right for patient is the right of access. So what do we mean under that? Is that all patient got the right to obtain a copy of all the personal data that could concern them. Afterwards, when they get the access of it, they also got the right of rectification. That means that they've got the right to correct any data that could be inaccurate or incomplete. Also, they've got the right of erasure. So this allows all patients to require the removal or deletion of personal data in our database. And the last thing, of course, when we do inform our patient, they've got the right to object or restrict the secondary use that we could make of their samples. So this is all the rights that are given to our patient and that are all mentioned in the information letter that we share with them to acquire their samples.
So after overview these legal aspects, the question is how FTB is complying with that. So FTB guarantees of the legal aspect of its suppliers for the end users. FTB is checking the conformity of the patient inform letter. It also checks the opposition procedures. That checks the preparation, storage, and export authorization. And collaborate with an externalized data protection official to ensure the security of the data. So all of these checking points ensure the conformity of our suppliers. So do you think the checkpoints implemented by FTB are sufficient for you? So to sum up this presentation, what you need to remember, the information to patient is a first step for the use of human biospecimens and data. In the case of non-interventional researches, the opt-out is suitable. The supplier needs to have HBS collection and storage approval by an IRB, and it's the same process for the HBH export. The data treatment is controlled and checked by the European GDPR, and all the samples and data transferred by FTB come from approved and validated suppliers. So thank you for listening, and let's go for question, Maria.
You're on mute, Maria.
Apologies. Thank you so much both for that presentation. It was very informative. And I do see we have quite a few questions that have come in. So